Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Lydia Vroldemian speaking. I am the Secretary General of Science Europe, the organization representing research funding organizations and research performing organizations in Europe. And I am extremely pleased to welcome you all into this symposium for interdisciplinarity for the net zero transition in the framework of COP27. It's our COP27 lead up event. I am even more pleased because I am surrounded by very good colleagues from different networks of universities and research organizations, especially the colleagues from UNICA, the Universities Network of the Capitals of Europe, CESAER, the network of engineering organizations in Europe, EUA, the European University Association, ENSC, the International Network of Sustainable Campuses, and the University of Strathclyde. They all have contributed to the generation of this event that we thought it was very timely because interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary research is something that we believe is of utmost importance to tackle the challenges related to the net zero transition. To put you a little bit of context of this event organized by so many networks, well, this was an initiative that in fact was born last year. We had the first event last year in which we agreed to put our brains together to share our actions and to structure our work around a series of actions that we deem essential as universities and research organizations. We share a vision where research and education communities work together and in interaction with industry and with society to solve urgent global challenges. It is on the name of this vision that last year we published a call to action to research organizations to face the net zero transition, which included 6 main lines of activities. A main line of activity, the first one, was to respond to the complexity of the net zero challenges by addressing them in an interdisciplinary way. That is precisely the subject of our meeting today. Developing the next generation of students and researchers for the net zero transition, reducing our own organizational carbon footprint, supporting the net zero transition in policymaking at all levels, improving the shared understanding of what needs to be done, and last but not least, facing the challenges together. So these were the 6 actions. You can consult the call to action. We'll put it shortly in the webinar, in the web chat, so you can follow it. But they structure our work in the different individual organizations and institutions, but also when we come together, as it is the case today. In this workshop today, in this event today, we would like to deepen on the views of research funders and universities and on policies and international perspectives to gain a better understanding of what needs to be done, what are we doing, and what actions we need to put in place for better approaching these challenges. The net zero transition is a humongous challenge. Unfortunately, progress towards reducing emissions is far from ideal. We all know that. And we from research organizations and universities believe that is more urgent to act and to act together. For that, I am extremely pleased to give the word to Douglas Halliday, who is professor at Durham University, and he is the chair of the EUA Green Deal Task and Finish Group. So, Douglas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for that very kind introduction and for setting the scene so clearly. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this online symposium looking at interdisciplinarity for the net zero transition. As Lydia says, I'm Douglas Halliday. I'm Professor of Physics at Durham University and Chair of the EUA Green Deal Task and Finish Group. My co-panelists on this session will be able to introduce themselves when I very soon invite them to speak. So this first panel, we're going to be considering interdisciplinary actions for the net zero transition. And we're going to look at the views of those from research funders and university perspectives. We'll be hearing about some practical examples of these kinds of interdisciplinary actions and projects, looking at the characteristics of interdisciplinary working and thinking about how to implement this more widely amongst those attending today and promoting that amongst the networks that we are part of. So just some initial comments from me before I invite our panelists to make some introductory comments of their own. What do we mean by interdisciplinarity? Well, for me, that's when experts and researchers from different backgrounds, different expertise come together to work on a specific challenge or area of focus, seeking to answer a range of research questions. Interdisciplinary working, from my own experience, can certainly be challenging. It requires a willingness to work together. It requires a respect for different viewpoints and a recognition that your own views and understandings will evolve and be challenged as a result. Interdisciplinarity, I think, frames questions in different ways, taking account of a broader range of factors than just those from your own disciplinary perspective. It requires new ways of communicating that I think enhances understanding, not always using the vocabulary of a single discipline. And I think finally, for me, interdisciplinarity can reveal complexities that sometimes were previously hidden. So what I'd like to do is invite each of our panelists to make some introductory comments, and then we'll have a discussion about some of the different aspects of interdisciplinary working. Perhaps I can invite Alberto as the second panelist to introduce yourself and make some introductory comments. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in this symposium representing CESAER, which is an association of 57 European universities on science and technology. I'm here in my capacity of secretary of a task force called Sustainability, which will working all together up until October next year for the next 12 months in preparing this vision of sustainability amongst our universities and the association. I'm also a vice rector for quality and efficiency at Polytechnic University of Madrid, Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, and been working in the sustainability programs of my university for the last 6 years. And I know how difficult it is to promote interdisciplinarity. I'll give you a few examples, but let me first convey you the idea of the CESAER's work, which is really to combine different areas of the different universities, including science, learning. The different task forces of CESAER are contributing to the idea of how universities can promote more sustainable means of managing organizations, promoting scientific and technology development in the area of sustainability, and in particular, net zero transition, and also working as the mission of learning, teaching, training. How do we include that? So sustainability as a task force combines the efforts of different task forces of the association, and we will be preparing a white paper for next October to be presented in Madrid, and also a declaration. My idea of interdisciplinarity, as I was saying, really is hard to promote, and just a few examples. At UPM, in the last 10 years, we've published 2,000 papers related to SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, and more than 1,000 papers directly related to SDG 13, climate action. Amongst our courses, 532 courses offered to our students contain learning outcomes related to SDGs, as declared by the professors responsible of these courses. And yet, the university did very little to stimulate, nurture, and incentivize interdisciplinary work until we started pursuing some ideas in programs, about of which I hope that I have the chance to explain and to comment in the panel discussion today. So let's recognize this difficulty, but at the same time, let's emphasize the importance of interdisciplinarity in achieving net zero transition. So thank you very much, Douglas, and I'll be happy to explain more about this later on.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I'd like to now move on and invite Matthew to introduce yourself, Matthew, and make some introductory comments. Thank you.
Douglas, thank you very much. I'm Matthew. I'm Senior Learning, Teaching and Reporting Manager in the University of Edinburgh's Department for Social Responsibility and Sustainability. I'm also the facilitator of the UNICA Green and Sustainable Development Goals Working Group as well. So delighted to be here, and thank you so much for those who have organised today's event. I just want to share some initial thoughts on this area and provide some examples of action across UNICA and Edinburgh very briefly. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that by adopting whole institutional approaches, universities can break down silos, they can support innovation and encourage collaboration across disciplines and industry, maximising the positive impact that they can have on cities and society. This approach, I feel, needs to be further strengthened and implemented by universities for that net zero transition. Universities need to embed this in how research is conducted, how to ensure students from an early stage critically engage and see the value in interdisciplinary learning. And I think this is a key requirement for preparing our students to be future leaders in this area. At the University of Edinburgh, we have started to develop new structures to support interdisciplinary research and learning through the Edinburgh Earth Initiative and the Edinburgh Futures Institute, with the aim to deliver multiple benefits to the university across research, student experience, the civic mission, but also to society as well. But I think it's important, as Alberto highlighted, in my experience, there are challenges to supporting interdisciplinary approaches. We have to be honest about that, but I think there are hopefully solutions to those, and the opportunity to deliver multiple benefits through this approach is very much something universities need to aim for. I'm delighted that UNICA is encouraging member universities to grasp these opportunities through a new call to action on the climate and environmental emergency, asking universities to take significant action to further harness their academic research and communities to support society and capital cities and policymakers in the transition to net zero, with interdisciplinary approaches at the heart of that. Many thanks for the opportunity today, and I look forward to our discussion. Back to you, Douglas.
Marlene, I was going to invite you to introduce yourself and make some comments. Please proceed.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this interesting seminar. I am Marlene Moberg. I'm a Senior Research Officer at Formas, which is called a Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development. And at Formas, I particularly work with a Swedish National Research Program on climate, which I think very much inhabits a lot of this approaches on interdisciplinary research. This program is more of a challenge-driven research funding instrument, which has its main goal to provide knowledge for supporting the climate transformation in societies. Additionally, I'm also the chair of the Science Europe Working Group on Green and Digital Transition. And in my opening remarks here, I would like to focus on the main findings in the report that will be launched later today at Science Europe, which has been an initiative taken within this working group on the green and digital transition, where we wanted to, with a survey, trying to collect and combine what the Science Europe member organizations are doing in the field of green and digital transition, where we focus on particularly on interdisciplinary research on and for the green and digital transition. So this report, it has a twofold aim. It both brings a mapping of experiences among Science Europe member organizations, on interdisciplinary research, and it's also trying to extract from the survey and to focus groups. We also organized to propose recommendations which can support and facilitate the strengthening or improving the interdisciplinary work on interdisciplinary research approaches to green and digital transition. So I just want to kick off with a few findings on the interdisciplinarity here. So one of the questions we work with is how to define interdisciplinarity, a little bit what also Douglas introduced here. And in general, what we saw in the responses is that the organization work at Science Europe member organization approach interdisciplinarity in a very open sense. And this openness is also very strongly related to that. To define disciplines, it's very much related on what kind of disciplines we talk about, in which context, in which organizational settings. Different countries in Europe, among European countries, has different way of how universities are organized. And we also saw that is also that disciplines is constantly evolving. So in order to be able to have this more open approach, that also interdisciplinarity could mean very different forms, different labels. The organization approach interdisciplinarity in a broad sense, where it is for collaboration, which is essential. It is that it is often more challenge driven, that is key. And it's also collaboration, not only between academics, but also within academia and also with actors outside academia. And a second aspect, what we also found in what we discussed in the report, is the importance. Why is interdisciplinarity often called for when we are talking about challenges like the green and digital transitions? And here it is often related to that when we are interested in more wicked problems, then the interdisciplinarity has a main strength in order to that it is needed to have combined different approaches, and it's also often driven by joint aspects of trying to deal with current challenges in society. And then the last aspect is related to maybe the funding agencies, particularly on how to fund and the assessment processes of interdisciplinary research, where we particularly saw that in general, it is the same kind of approaches as with more disciplinary-based calls or funding processes, but maybe with a particular emphasis on the qualitative aspects in the research proposal, which also is very much in line with the ongoing what is called the agreement on reforming of research assessment, and that really the emphasis on the qualitative dimension of assessing research. But I stop here from my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malin. And Melissa, welcome back. I'd like to invite you now to introduce yourself and make some preliminary comments. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you very clearly.
Excellent. You know, my kids definitely wish that they had a mute button for me. So, so thank you so much for having me. I am Melissa Brown-Goodall. I run a program called the Environmental Innovations Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, and I also work with the International Sustainable Campus Network, particularly on programs related to global policy. Thinking through what I've heard so far today, and I'm super excited actually to be last now because I have a few thoughts just in terms of what's been reflected on so far. Antonio Guterres very recently said, it's a now or never proposition that we're working on, and we have to sort of break down. And those of us who are working in some of the older institutions of the world have inherited these silos academically. It's very common to have these barriers within the institution, and those barriers have to do, they interfere at times with how students need to study and with raising money and with various elements of being on a venerable campus. And so being a part of a network like the ISCN is extremely important because we can push each other. I call it collaboration. We like to nudge each other, and then we like to use each other as inspiration to be better in these things. The other thing that I focus on a very regular basis is Christiana Figueres's mantra of stubborn optimism, because if we keep talking about what we're terrified of, it may very well get in the way of what we really need to happen. And so if we start to cast a positive vision for the future and get people working toward it, that's going to be a much more effective tool. And then the last sort of inspirational quote I'll add here is last year I hosted this amazing interdisciplinary panel of women talking about equity, justice, systemic change, etc. And afterwards, my daughter, who is a college student right now, called me and said I'd totally missed the mark because we talked about all these huge ideas and we utterly failed to say, okay, so here are these wicked problems and here are some interdisciplinary solutions and here's what each individual can do to be a part of this. This is how they, on a day-to-day basis, connect with one another. So sort of taking those as my reference points, we're creating something at the University of Pennsylvania called One Planet, One Pen. And the idea here is that we need to take this wicked problem and identify the role that every discipline can play. So we actually, next week, will be launching an academic climate commitment for each of our 12 schools. So veterinary medicine, communications, business, each one will have a very public-facing commitment that says, this is how our discipline connects directly, and here's the courses, and here's how we're going to measure our success. So then we're going to build on that over time, because each one is also, these are all very specifically related to the discipline. They're all natural to the strategic priorities of the school. And then collaboration. We're starting to foster ways that students can get enrolled in classes together, ways that we can form cohorts of students and faculty members. Another element of this is that we have something called research communities. We invite faculty members from the institution to define a specific problem, and we give them funding to create a community. It's not a research project with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a community that evolves over time. And it can be local, it can be global, but it has to have a public-facing outcome. This is not the time for academia to hold back its knowledge until it's perfect, or to hold back its knowledge because it's so empirical that it would be muddied by being applied. It has to have public facing, and it has to have opportunities for students, because we really need to get moving in a much more dynamic way. Similarly, we're creating a fellows program. We've started with representation from across our entire institution. We get them together every other month, and we're starting to have them. You say the word resilience to this group and they all perk up, even though one is an architect and one is a fish biologist. It doesn't matter. They all get excited about this. And so creating at a micro level those opportunities, because ultimately this is how we're going to be raising funds. This is how we're going to be solving problems. This is how we're going to be educating today's students. And then the last thing I'll just touch on briefly is that we are also taking the global challenges to our campus in a way that we're actually reviewing the teaching and research of all of our faculty members in the University of Pennsylvania, and we're comparing what they do to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the rationale is not, hey, the University of Pennsylvania supports the SDGs. It's actually, hey, these are priorities that were set at the global level. And this is the expertise that we bring to the table. So we can now generate an aggregated sense, analytically rigorous, aggregated sense of what we're particularly good at, but it also helps us to develop a database, a searchable database, so that somebody can come to me and say, I need somebody who's interested in climate, health, and cities, and I can generate a list, or we can ultimately next semester plug them in so that they could do their own searches. So bringing these resources together to make sure that people on our campuses, because as we grow, as we become enmeshed in our own disciplines, it's hard for people to figure out who's also really keen on this stuff. So that's the purpose behind that. And I'll stop there because I know I went past my 3 minutes. I apologize.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that. And thank you to each of our panelists for some really interesting thoughts, ideas, and examples, which we can pick up on as our discussion emerges. So I'd just like to remind all webinar participants that you can insert comments and questions in the chat window in Zoom, and colleagues at Science Europe will be monitoring that and making sure that we deal with those, if at all possible, during our time. So we've heard quite a lot of really positive examples and thoughts and ideas from panelists, as well as some of the challenges. So I'd like to open the discussion by asking the panelists if they had to define the key benefits of interdisciplinarity in order to be able to promote it more widely. How would you describe, or what do you see as the key benefits of interdisciplinary working, or the key attributes or aspects of interdisciplinary working? So Alberto, perhaps I could go back to you, as you started first, and you indeed talked about the challenge at your institution. So how would you go about promoting more interdisciplinary working at your own institution?
Thank you, Douglas. I'll be very brief, and commenting on what Melissa was saying, we created networks of thematic communities around several topics, and we created two of them. One, it was a collaboratory for decarbonization, and the other one was creating an emission-free university. These two thematic networks were given several themes. One, we hired one manager for each one of those to make sure that the collaboration ran smoothly, and the projects that came based on the creation of these communities would translate into proposals, projects, whatever collaboration the members of the communities came up with. We also developed a program to create a joint infrastructures. That means big infrastructure that could be used by different communities that propose projects that came up from the collaboration. And finally, we gave some seed money for the communities, again, to prepare proposals, run seminars, discuss about potential collaborations. This light structure, very, very simple, just putting some incentives for collaboration, has been very successful. And so far, we've identified several areas in which the research institutes, the different research groups are collaborating. Certainly, the benefits of that is always a broader perspective of the different technologies and scientific development, and certainly more win-win collaborations in terms of the types of findings that groups from different disciplines, from different areas can create. And once this is running, I think our researchers get more sense of getting into less risky approach and investment of their time and expectations. And so far, I think this has been very successful. But we need, as organizations, we need to invest resources, put some effort, some support, and let them go, let them run their goals more in a bottom-up approach based on their findings and their ideas and their expectations. Thank you, Douglas.
Thanks very much, Alberto. And Matthew, you talked about what you had learned from COVID and breaking down the barriers and silos. So what is it about that you would like to continue to promote at Edinburgh in terms of embedding interdisciplinary working further?
Yeah, Douglas, a couple of points I'll pick up in there. I think for me, this is about, the university's vision and that kind of civic mission, in terms of we're not going to maximize the potential of universities to benefit society if we don't take this interdisciplinary approach to these kind of wicked problems or global challenges. So I think for me, looking at kind of some practical learnings from that within not just the University of Edinburgh, but other UNICA members, it's about the culture. So you really need to embed that within the values of your organization, but also how do you actually apply that tangibly to staff communities, student communities, and alumni. I think secondly, it's about trying to provide structures that support that within universities. We don't want to stop fantastic local innovation across academic schools. What we want to do is strengthen that and bring that together with other disciplines to really maximize that benefit. And I think a key thing that's often overlooked in universities is communication. I think one thing that could be improved across many universities is that internal communication, raising awareness of what's happening across these different diverse communities, these different academic schools, so people can join the dots and make those links. So I think for me, communication often overlooked, but so important, especially to this discussion.
No, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Matthew. And just moving on, Malin, when you were talking, you talked a little bit about the focus and sort of what the interdisciplinary working was seeking to tackle. I mean, perhaps maybe you could expand a little bit more on that as the key sort of attribute of successful working.
Yes, I can try. No, I think if one thinks, I think it relates that interdisciplinarity often is called for when we are dealing with societal challenges, as also Matthew talked about here, and I think everyone. And I think one of what we have seen both within the working group at the Science Europe working group on green and digital transition, but also at the work at Formas, is that in order to focus, it's I think this is the dual process where this is needed in order to be able to be strengthened, and that is both what is happening in the academic universities and the possibility for career paths for interdisciplinary researchers, and the evaluation processes and the metric system within the universities, how to make this more interdisciplinary career paths. But then at the same time, it also what the funding agencies are doing, how they assess research, how they encourage and find the so to say the instruments, the funding instruments, where I think sometimes it's really the strength, it's quite big long-term programs, but in other areas it might rather be to make a lot of to plant seeds. So you can have a different novel approaches at the same time and allowing risk-taking approaches. So I think it is to working with several different instruments, and then of course different funding agencies could here have different roles where what they focus on. But I think this multiplicity is important in the funding system, in being able to encourage. And then just to add a little bit what we do at Formas as a funding agency is really this, I would like to say, a very careful process in order to select the experts for the panel, for those who will review. So both that if you have had, for instance, a call on climate transformation, you really try to ensure that those who are in the expert committee really reflects the different dimension which you can foresee will be part in the applications in that call. But it is also that each panel members also assess their own expertise on each individual approach before we as a funding agency distribute who will review which proposal. So it's really trying to making sure that you have this combination of expertise, where also Formas always work on equal basis, having academic expertise and societal stakeholders as well. But then, so I think it's a dual way of trying to work both within the academic system and funding agencies. And here I also see some promising collaboration and discussions here, how to make this, how to strengthen these efforts. Thank you.
No, thank you. Some really interesting points coming out in your discussion there. Thanks, Malin. And Melissa, moving on to you. I mean, I was very struck when you were speaking about your sense of community and identity. So perhaps thinking about some of what we could promote in terms of encouraging interdisciplinarity. For you, what does it say about the identity of different groups of individuals, of staff, and of students? How do you see that linking in to promoting new ways of interdisciplinary working?
You know, that's a question that I hope I can answer in the next few years. It's really, well, because, I work just on the faculty piece of it. I work with Northeastern University a bit because they're building a remarkable set of programs around this. And they are doing hiring now, and they're now stipulating that all new faculty hires must be in 2 schools. And this is a new thing. This is fascinating and it's fabulous. However, we cannot deny silly things like the tenure process is very different in, say, the School of Architecture than the School of Environment, which is not, and those aren't Northeastern schools. But the reality is that the expectations for faculty members in particular, there are very challenging barriers there that are difficult to overcome. And we're having these discussions too with, for example, one of our faculty members is an economist who's excited to work with everyone, but not excited to publish with anyone because the publishing piece of her portfolio needs to reflect the standards of excellence for the school where she is. So these are the these are the wicked problems of academia, right? Which are unfortunately we're trying to navigate in parallel with these other wicked problems. However, looking at sort of the bigger picture, identifying these programs that these communities created, and very similar, it sounds, to like what Alberto's got going on. So for example, we're working in our neighborhood in West Philadelphia. Last year, we had one research community where they installed edible gardens. Faculty were involved, students got in there and taught the kids at that school. The community group at that school was available. And now we had so much excitement and momentum that this year we funded them again. And now they're doing air quality monitoring inside the school. And they're working with the science teachers, and we're doing stormwater assessments. And so the students are getting this very, very practical hands-on knowledge, as well as connecting to the community. And many of us work in universities where there's some tension between the university and its neighborhood. So this is a way for us to have a very proactive and positive and equal relationship, because there's give and take there. And I think defining these at the micro scale is important. And what we hope to do ultimately is really use this as a model to sort of scale up. And this is not me trying to overwhelm the campus as a lab concepts that folks hold near and dear, but this is just a different iteration of a way to really meet all of the points of collaboration between the disciplines. So we have architects, we have educators, we have engineers all working together on these projects, making sure that each one has the opportunity to say, there's the problem, here's my piece of the solution, is how we're approaching it.
That's great, Melissa. Thank you. Some really interesting developments there. And, I wish you success with that initiative in recruiting staff to multiple schools. Students study across multiple schools, so I'm sure staff might be expected to have similar flexibility. In the time that's left, I'd like to sort of maybe open out the discussion for the panel and think about how does interdisciplinarity encourage a systems thinking approach. Panel members have all mentioned to a lesser or greater degree the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got 19 of those, of which energy, climate change are specific examples. And those are framed around very clearly articulated challenges that were developed a few years ago, and yet historically our own universities are structured very differently. At my university we have science, social sciences, arts and humanities. So what is it about interdisciplinarity that really enables academics and researchers and others involved in funding projects to sort of come together? And what do we actually mean by a systems thinking approach? So I'm very happy to open that out to panel members rather than work my way around. So who wants to go first? I think Malin and then Melissa. Okay.
Yeah. No, I just would like to add regarding the system thinking approach. I think it's I like the phrase from Peter Sheckland where he emphasizes on soft systems thinking, that he differentiates between hard systems thinking, which builds upon that you actually could set the boundaries for a system. Whereas when you're working with soft systems thinking, then you have always artificial boundaries, because you need in some way or another put up boundaries in order to make a study, in order to conduct a research or designing a policy. But the boundaries will always be artificial in the sense that you can always add an additional layer, you can always add an additional approach. And I think bearing in mind that as soon as we are dealing with societal challenges, with issues on society, then we are in a soft systems thinking. We need that. We need to always be aware that it's always provisional, what we know, and it always will be based also around a lot of values. And I think that changes the way in which how we design the study, how we design also the policy making around those issues. So I think that is the main reason why I think the call for interdisciplinarity is often very strong, related to sustainable development, health issues, climate change, and so on. So I leave that to Melissa to add here. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. Yes, so Melissa, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm delighted to follow that because I wholeheartedly agree. And the reality is the Sustainable Development Goals serve an important purpose in terms of saying these are our priorities, but they are not relatable to the majority of humans. That's just not what humans are experiencing. And so while they're a necessary framework in some ways, they kind of, I hate to say this out loud, but they miss the boat in some ways. I'm probably going to be blackballed from all future discussions. But here's the thing. If you say to someone, life on land, life underwater, they're thinking over there. If you say food, then they get it. And agriculture is something that we're missing there. So when we're talking about systems, we need to make it personal and relatable to all humans, not just all disciplines. So looking at sustainable agriculture as an example, we need the veterinary scientists at the table. We need the farmers at the table. We need the humans who eat food and who transport food at the table. And if you take a problem-centric approach, which is very effective, you say, hey, look at this. We're all having problems with, say, coastal flooding or with getting food to our tables. Take that problem-centric approach and then bring it to the folks who need to have perspective on it. It's a much more effective way of doing things. And I think that there's this disconnect. And as we, the academics, because we are terrible about this, to Matthew's point, we are the worst communicators on the planet, but we have so much knowledge that we can bring to these tables. So I think that there's a real need to both get the technical disciplines working together, but also make sure that we're involving the social sciences and the humanities, because this is not a scientific challenge. This is a humanities challenge.
Yeah, thanks. Alberto, you wanted to come in next, I think, and then Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas. Well, first, let me say that Melissa is an exception to being one of the worst communicators. She's been very strong communicator, if I may. But I'd like to follow up on her topic of food, because I had the privilege to work in a project organized by the EASAC, which is the Association of Academies of Science in Europe, to prepare a report for the European Commission about food security. And I had the privilege to work together with people that were experts in nutrition, all the way down to experts that looked at the earth sciences, water, land, soils, all together. And it became clear to me that without that approach, this combination of disciplines, we would not have a complete picture of the problem of food security. And this allowed this group to prepare a document that combined elements from all these disciplines and to convey the European Commission this approach in terms of addressing food security. And for me, that was a clear hands-on experience in which I learned a lot, and it was just a collaboration of several meetings and working together in a document. I cannot tell to what extent, if we had kept on working together, many more ideas, many more projects would have come out of that simple collaboration. So certainly, I have a note here. The domains are the more domains are involved, the richer and broader the scope of research. And this adds more questions to projects and collaborations, reaching out larger communities and more stakeholders. So for me, this is one way to put it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Matthew, would you like to sort of make some comments on that before I come to questions from the webinar?
Very much so. Yeah, thank you, Douglas. Just a few brief points from me. I think part of this is about responding to student demand and student need. If you look at students organising for sustainability in the UK, who undertake research about student opinions, they are wanting this as part of their academic studies, as part of this kind of student experience that they have. You know, they want to be able to understand how their discipline interacts with other disciplines and that kind of systems thinking. They want to understand how they can deliver positive change through their individual actions, but also their future careers as well. They want to demonstrate leadership. And I think secondly, I think, you know, Melissa highlighted that point about making a tangible link to individuals. And I think universities can use this as a way to generate shared ownership of that university vision, that civic mission, in terms of if you have that tangible link to individuals, academics, professional staff, students, alumni, there's some kind of generated shared ownership there of that civic mission, of that culture. Going back to my point initially, you know, we need to develop a culture that has interdisciplinary approaches at its heart, and that's one way certainly to do it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks very much. Well, we've got a few minutes left before we come to the first break in the symposium. So there are two questions that have come into the chat, which I'm going to put to our panel. So the first is a question about funding, and was simply asking how much funding you can use for small programs. And it says that many public universities in Central Europe struggle with funding issues. So has anyone got any reflections or thoughts or suggestions about how you can maybe use modest or small sums of money to stimulate some kind of activity that we've been talking about? What's been your best experience?
If I may, just one comment. To give you an idea, we are at UPM spending about 10% of the research budget, our own budget, in promoting this thematic network. So it's not so much money, but you can create some incentives to collaborate in interdisciplinary projects and associations with not much resources. And in this case, it would be several €100,000. And with that, you can do a lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And then mindful of the time, the other question we've got is really, it's around the different visions that different sectors have. The question talks about ministries, companies, and indeed different countries. So, you know, we've been exploring and articulating a sense of the vision of universities, but, you know, what brief reflections from the panel, any experiences on how you communicate and indeed develop and share a vision across different sectors, any reflections to report in that area?
I'll chime in just briefly. On the former question, we find seed grants very effective, of even just $5,000, because that gets you a paid student assistant. And frequently in a university, time is even more precious than money. Space is the most precious thing up until the COVID pandemic. But in terms of the question that you've just asked, you know, I think that the biggest influence universities can have is reflecting on the professionals that we're training for tomorrow. So for example, these academic climate commitments that I mentioned, where, you know, our School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania helped us to take the lead on that project. And they're not just looking at their own footprint on campus and their own classes. What they're looking at is the relationship they have with their industry. Can they be pushing for more sustainable food supplies, more sustainable pet supplies, et cetera? And the same thing's happening in our School of Dental Medicine, same thing's happening in our School of Business. So, you know, and again, this is incremental change, unfortunately, but we can leverage our influence. And to Matthew's point, the appetite from the students is so strong that if we don't get moving faster, and if we don't start to really push the industries that we're sending our professionals into, we're going to get into trouble. So I feel like there is really good momentum. And then working with cities, you know, town gown relationships, it's so important. Most universities in the world are in cities, and there is an imperative for collaboration around solutions. And any university that has property in a city or that leases property in a city, like it happens frequently in Europe, there is a direct relationship right there that can't be denied in terms of being prepared as a coastal community and or as an urban community.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Matthew, were you going to make a quick brief comment there before we wrap up the session?
Yes, just very briefly. I think it's about empowering staff and students and alumni to influence. And it goes back to demonstrate leadership in terms of change management as well. Something that I think actually should be embedded within the curriculum, the student and staff experience, actually that training. And especially from a UNICA point of view, we are based within the capital cities of Europe. There's a fantastic opportunity to influence policymakers, both local and national, to reflect some of the civic mission that I've talked about with university. There's a real opportunity there.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, Malin and Alberto, just very briefly, because we're
yes, thank you. I just want to tell you that CESAER is working in this area of incentivizing interdisciplinarity, and we are very happy to be in this symposium, and hopefully we will be producing an interesting white paper in which interdisciplinarity will be a major topic in our white paper on sustainability for universities. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Good, thank you. And finally, Malin?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add on this last question in the chat. I think this with the mobility as well, because of course there are big differences and various forms of logic in these different organizations. I think that is something we need to deal with. And I think here it is also to strengthen mobility, that by being in different forms of organization and different organizational settings, you can learn and understand, and thereby also maybe find the ways in which how to work with these different ways of viewing, valuing the work processes in different organizations. So I think here is also to strengthen the mobility for researchers, for policymakers, and also in industry, that you're not fixed. Your career path should not be fixed in one of these organizations. That is actually this mobility could also enhance the possibility to come together also. Thank you.
No, well, thank you very much, Malin. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this first discussion panel. So let me express my sincere thank you to Melissa, Alberto, Matthew and Malin for your very thoughtful comments, reflections and answers to my question. And I will be giving a brief summary of that in the final panel at the end of the day.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Here's Lydia Borodemian again, welcoming you back after the short break. I hope that you find a very good inspirational comments in the first panel on these very good examples of universities and research organizations implementing strategies to foster interdisciplinarity in students and researchers. We are now moving on our event, opening the second panel discussion, which will be on the visions, on the views of policies and international perspectives. And it will be moderated by Peter Kaderjak, who is head of the Zero Carbon Hub at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and welcome all of the participants and speakers to the second session of this workshop. It's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to continue the discussion that you already started. As it was mentioned, I am working in Hungary at Zero Carbon Hub, the mission of which institution is exactly to promote interdisciplinary efforts to promote green transition or net zero transition in Hungary. It is my distinguished pleasure to welcome our panelists to the second panel, concentrating on concrete interdisciplinary actions for the net zero transition. Sam Barrett is with us, who is Chief of Youth Education and Advocacy of the United Nations Environment Program. Very nice to have you, Brad. At UNEP, Sam co-founded the Playing for the Planet Alliance, a collaboration with the video gaming industry to nudge gamers' behavior and for the industry to use cleaner energy. Sam also oversees the work of UNEPs to support higher education to decarbonize and shift the mindsets towards sustainability in universities across the world. It's also my great pleasure to have Pablo Del Rio from Spain with us. And Pablo is a distinguished researcher who is also head of the Environmental Economics Group at the Institute for Public Policies and Goods at the Spanish National Research Council, and also the member of the Science Europe Working Group for the Green and Digital Transition. Pablo is also a renowned economist and scholar who spent more than 20 years looking particularly at renewable energy policies, eco-innovation, and the circular economy. Welcome, Pablo. Matt Dole is also from Canada. Thank you very much for joining. And Matt is the director for the Office of Wellbeing Strategy at the University of British Columbia, which is situated on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In his role, Matt provides strategic direction and capacity building support for UBS Wellbeing, a collaborative effort across UBS to become a health promoting campus where all people, places, and communities can flourish. A very nice job to do indeed. Thank you very much for joining. And last but not least, we also have from Mexico with us, Luis Alberto Serra Barragan, who is Associate Dean of Research and Executive Director of the Energy Initiative at Technology, the Monterrey. And Luis Alberto is also Executive Director of the Energy Initiative at Tecnológico de Monterrey. Over the last decade, Luis had led multidisciplinary teams to conduct applied research and consulting projects for firms and federal government agencies in North America in energy, economics development, and sustainable themes. Luis Alberto is also a member of the Energy Task Force of Agenda 2030 of the UN Global Compact's Mexico chapter, and he is also a member of the group of experts of the Sustainable Development Solution Networks in Mexico. So I think we have really a very nice composition now to talk about the relationship between science and interdisciplinary research and policy making, and how the messages from the research community can be communicated and essentially sold to policy makers, and also communicated to the society. So during this panel, we really try to focus on the concrete interdisciplinary actions that can support net zero transition. And the key questions we want to look at more carefully is first the science policy interaction, a very delicate issue, I think, but you should have a lot of experience on that. So how to engage the researchers and also energy and climate policymakers to cooperate in moving towards net zero, so that science-informed policy appreciates contributions from interdisciplinary research. That's a tough competition for the attention for policymakers. I think that we have to carry it out to get policymakers to engage. Second, we will also look at the question, what are the challenges of interdisciplinary science policy to support that interaction to become effective, and also try to come to the question on what impact might more emphasis on interdisciplinarity have on researchers' careers compared to those who are involved in more science careers. Before I give the floor to you for a brief 2-3 minutes introductory comments to send your main messages about your experiences covering the questions that we discussed, I would just like to take maybe 1 minute to refer to my my own experience as a former energy and climate state secretary for Hungary, that when we talk about net zero transition, we talk 80% about energy policy, given that greenhouse gas emissions are mostly related to the use of fossil fuels, and globally we still use 80% of our to meet our energy needs from fossil fuels. So energy is very much in the center of the net zero transition, to my understanding, and it's very good that we have participants, panelists with much experience also in this field. Now, when we talk about energy, it's really about power and influence, and moves towards net zero have huge impacts on the constituencies and electorate of governments. Energy is about power, is about influence, and also about big business, because net zero means a huge investment into replacing our current energy infrastructure. So big business is very much interested in getting involved. Now, policymakers who make the decisions on net transition, net zero transition, they are on the potentially on the demand side for science-based solutions for net zero, as opposed to universities and research communities who are on the supply side to provide the solutions for policymakers. Now, universities really compete for the attention and the demand, I think, of policymakers for solutions. We compete with communities that are counter-incentivized towards net zero transition, like the fossil energy industry. We are in competition for the attention of policymakers with industrial lobby groups to promote their own solutions for net zero, which might not be the optimal ones. We are in competition at universities with professional consultancy also, who try to carry out interdisciplinary research or work to provide solutions for policymakers, also NGOs, global NGOs, to provide solutions. So I would very much like to later on direct the attention and the direction of the discussion on really looking at what could be the competitive advantage of the research community to provide net zero science-based policy solutions to policymakers, and how the research funding community can help to improve the competitive advantages of the research community. Now, I stop here with my introductory remarks, and would like to ask each of you that please introduce a little bit more deeper yourself and summarize your major messages with regard to the topic of the panel. So maybe I can go in the sequence as it is indicated in the brochure. So I would first like to ask Sam Barrett to give your comments, please.
Thanks, Peter. So I've just got a couple of things I'd say. One is, I do think the research outcomes of higher education are fundamental for the challenges that we face, because the need for innovation, the need for new learning, the need for pretty transformative action will be informed by the great minds that we have in higher education. So I do think the time for kind of incremental changes is past, and the time for really radical, bold, new thinking is upon us, because we've left it far too late to do what we needed to do many years ago, but for a range of reasons that hasn't happened. So I do think the research agenda needs to be supercharged, and I think we need to be thinking hard and deeply about the radical new approaches we need to take. The second thing I'd like to say is I feel like universities are seen mainly through the prism of new research rather than through the prism of how they operate as a system, how they operate within a city, and how they operate with their students. And I feel like when it comes to this net zero decarbonisation agenda, it's more limited to what new things can we create or kind of introduce, as opposed to how do universities who kind of bring 250 million students through their doors every single year across every country in the planet work with that next generation to think about what are their habits, what are their skill sets, what are their mindsets. And so I think there needs to be a new approach in higher education to think about the responsibility for the generation that's coming through and what kind of inputs they can put into them around the choices they make and the actions they take. So I really think that the universities often think about certifying students to say, you came here, you have a certificate. But I think there needs to be a change in that to think about how universities think about the civic responsibility around shifting behaviors and norms in young people. And the third thing I'd say is I think nature needs to be on this agenda, not just climate. We have a triple planetary crisis, sadly. We're not dealing with just one, but with two others. And how we're drawing down on nature, which I think is a real superhero in the fight with climate, needs to be added to the list. And so I would say the race to net zero, and we spent a lot of time getting universities to make commitments, but also small things. I was in Oxford University just a couple of weeks ago, and particularly universities in the Northern Hemisphere. How do they save energy? How do they kind of get people in faculty to move from 22 to 19 degrees and to think about those real world, real time challenges? So for me, I feel like the challenge that we face is universities can be living labs for new thinking. I was with Loughborough University and about another 50 universities yesterday, thinking about the role that universities can play on sport for nature, around how their insight can help drive new agendas forward. So without wishing to say any more, Peter, I'd say universities, I think, need to be much less conservative in how they go about their work. The heritage they come from is great because they can fall back on that, but the future doesn't really kind of judge people on heritage and how many hundreds of years they've been around. I don't think people care about that anymore. And I would say universities need to be a lot more ambitious, a lot more courageous, and a lot more radical around how they think about the net zero challenge, because it's not an academic pursuit, it's an existential pursuit. And that means that we need to think about this challenge differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for this very straightforward messages. I think ours universities. Pablo Del Rio, it is your floor now.
Okay, well, let me start by thanking you for inviting me to this very challenging and relevant and fascinating meeting today. Yeah, well, I've been performing interdisciplinary research for more than 2 decades now, so I can provide, you know, the researcher point of view, the micro level point of view at this time. But apart from doing that, I would also like to briefly comment on 2 initiatives implemented at my institution, the Spanish National Research Council, to promote and support cross-disciplinary research. Well, the first one is the interdisciplinary thematic platforms at our institution. This collaboration initiative was created in 2018 and has been consolidated into several platforms. It is interesting because it's a finalist instrument of research and innovation, and it was created to address the multidisciplinary challenges of great scientific, economic, and social impact. The interesting thing in the context of today about this is these platforms are conceived as collaborative frameworks based on the mission concept, but they put together multidisciplinary knowledge of specific expert groups with universities, public administration, the private sector, social agents, and other institutions. Interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral research are ante conditions for approval and support of a platform. You can see all the platforms in this slide. So since the initiative is started, more than 30 platforms have been launched, mobilizing more than 600 research groups from 80 CSIC centers and institutes, and involving more than 80 companies, institutions, and social partners. Of course, not all the platforms are linked to the green transition or the digital transition, but a number of them are fully devoted. And another initiative that I would also like to share with you from our institution is the White Books Scientific Challenges 2030. Basically, these books, what they do, they present the reflections on 14 strategic themes established according to their scientific impact and social importance. They address fundamental questions. You can see the titles there, such as the origin of life, exploration of the universe, the development of clean, safe, and efficient energies, and they identify complex scientific challenges with the sustainable development goals being an articulating element of those challenges. Almost 1,200 researchers from over 115 CSIC centers and other institutions participated in this analysis. So they all agree on the need for this multidisciplinary approach. I would like to stress, as a researcher involved in one of these books, the process which led to the elaboration of these books, which entail a high level of cooperation and collaboration among researchers from different disciplines, and also I think this should be mentioned. And this is it. I think that it is a great topic. Of course, from a researcher point of view, I think that the challenge is, of course, to break this paradox of mission-driven research, which is needed for policy, and also the incentives created for individual researchers, which sometimes they are rather disciplinary. So I think this is somehow changing. In a way, we can discuss this later, but I think this is a main thing. And yeah, this is it on my side.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and also indicating us this rich experience that you already gained in Spain, promoting interdisciplinary research. Next, I would like to ask Matt. Please make your comments, please, on topics we are discussing.
Thank you, Peter, and great to be here. And I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm joining all of you from Vancouver in Canada, situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My work at UBC and as co-chair of both the Canadian and International Health Promoting Campus Networks is really about mobilizing knowledge across institutions. And this is through the Health Promoting Universities movement that's now become a strong interdisciplinary network of activity across the globe in over 40 countries. So I'll share three initial thoughts, which have actually been top of mind for me lately, because I'm editing a book currently with some colleagues, and we've been talking a lot about this as well, and sort of how we pull this book together and think about interdisciplinary research in this work. So first, I think it's critical that we recognize that climate change and its associated impacts are fundamental health determinants. And we can leverage interdisciplinary research to broaden our lens to think about well-being of people and ecology at the same time. Because really, to care for the health of our planet and of our people, we need to recognize that we need to do that in a way that's just and an equitable transition to net zero, and a focus on how people and places can flourish as part of that process. And that's going to take a holistic and systems-based focus on solutions, which many people have talked about already today, and draw on knowledge and relationships with our whole community on campus and off. And that's actually something that Indigenous scholars, elders, and knowledge holders have been doing and saying for millennia, which leads to my second point, which is that we need to really, I think, do a much, much better job of centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Indigenous people have proven that they've been most capable of caretaking of our lands in harmony with people for millennia, on our lands for more than 15,000 years. And so we have to do a better job, I think, in elevating their knowledge and their scholars. And so, for example, at UBC, we're only 100 years old as an institution, and the Musqueam people on whose lands we sit are regularly reminding us that this has actually been a place of learning for at least 15,000 years, and we're not leveraging that near enough. And the third point I wanted to make is that we can connect up to other networks like the Health Promoting Universities movement. And this is sort of a 2-for-1 opportunity. One, I think that allows us to better draw in fields such as nursing, psychology, medicine, kinesiology, social work, that can strengthen the connection between mental health, physical health, and climate change. At UBC, for example, we're a large institution, and the health sector represents over 50% of the total research funded on our campus. And at the same time, though, and this is a vigorous discussion we're having, we need to shift from a healthcare approach to a health promotion approach within the health sector. And they need to also view the climate as a key determinant of health and focus, but there's an enormous opportunity there. And the second part of that is we have a blueprint that we follow called the Okanagan Charter for Health Promoting Universities and Colleges that we found to be a very effective mobilizing effort for campuses to rally around the idea that we can leverage our campuses as settings for research and change, as well as a way of mobilizing that in broader society. I will pause there and look forward to the discussion after that.
Thank you very much, Matt, and for the very important messages on involving indigenous people knowledge, also finding solutions. Luis Alberto, you are very much involved, or you have been involved very much in your energy initiative at the university and consultancy. So how do you see the opportunities to make contact and make impact on policy from the researcher side?
Yeah, well, let me first thank you, Peter, for the introduction to this panel and say hi as well to my fellow panelists. I think as a university, Tec de Monterrey has been privileged to work across a wide array of sustainability projects with different stakeholders at the local level, nationally and abroad. We've also been able to pull strings and attach common interests with other federal governments in Latin America. As a region, you probably are all aware that apart from Africa and Asia, probably we're the ones that have the greatest challenges and the greatest impacts of not committing to net zero transition. So, and COVID-19 just made that loud and clear that we've been actually pushed back in the advancement of certain goals. So I think that as Tec de Monterrey, what we have done so far is to put at the center of our mission, our vision of the institution being the largest private university in Mexico and one of the largest in systems in Latin America. We've put at the center of our institution our goals, our vision to commit to innovation, internationalization, and impact. And precisely, you can see in my back this blue bag that it's called Blue Road. This is the plan to commit to reduce emissions at Tec de Monterrey. And we have been doing that not just within the institution, but also by accompanying with other municipalities and other states in Mexico, just inviting them to commit to the same type of goals and vision that we need as a country. I would say that transdisciplinarity is a great challenge, a complex system. And I take what Sam mentioned at the beginning. We are past due in what we have to do to commit to the net zero transmission. Actually, we're really late. And this is already made clear by the AR6 report last year. So climate change is already impacting our communities really hard. So we need to make bold statements from the research area. And I think that, as you mentioned, Peter, energy is responsible for 60% of the emissions, of the total emissions worldwide. So if you think about it, it's not just about committing not to burn fossil fuels. It's about a whole revolution that we require in terms of new materials to allow for raw materials not to come from the hydrocarbons industry. And you take into consideration that demand for oil is going to start decreasing to produce fuels within the next five years. But if you think about 2050, and you think about the raw materials that you still require for all the petrochemical industry, Matt mentioned things about health. So pharma is one of the industries that requires a lot of precursors from the industry of hydrocarbons. So we require a shift in vision in terms of the value chain of materials that we require to implement in different production settings. So I think that's probably one of the greatest battlefields that we're going to see in the next years in research. And as Tec de Monterrey, I'm going to finish here, we have been trying to address this problem and other sustainability problems in general within net zero to work across transdisciplinarity institutes within our own institution, creating these specialist groups of researchers that work with one common goal, different disciplines, and align with industries and governments as well, not just nationally, but also abroad. And I think that's a first step that we've taken towards that end.
Thank you very much, indeed, Luis Alberto, explaining your situation in Mexico and work streams. And now we have about 20 minutes for open discussion on the topics that we have on our agenda. And maybe I just would like to follow up a little bit partly on Matt's initial, Sam's initial comments at the beginning, urging for less conservatism and then for a much more radical approach from side of universities to address this radical problem that we are facing. I would just like really to ask the panelists here, do you think that the universities are ready for the change? Do you see that the research community is as I try to also indicate in my introduction, the research community is sufficiently competitive to provide the science-based solutions for the policymakers in your case. So please, if you have experience for demand for science-informed policy making in the field of net zero transition back at home, so you can, if you can put good examples when you were successful with your research products and to sell these to policymakers, it's now time to maybe also provide these examples to the audience. So I just wonder who would like to reflect on this.
Well, if I may put a couple of examples here, the ones that I mentioned, we've been privileged to work with Costa Rica's government as well as with Chile's government, and we're not working through the IDB Interdevelopment Bank to work with 26 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean towards producing a decarbonization strategy. We have a group working in complex systems and decision-making under deep uncertainty. So this involves a participatory-driven approach with policymakers within the research project. It's not just researchers doing their work at the desk and then trying to sell it to the policymaker. Rather than that, it's getting with the policymaker at the first step, at the very beginning, and then by discussing what are the goals that they would like to commit to, then you start to involve them from the get-go in the research project. And that's the way in which we have been working with these projects. We've also worked in other topics towards water management as well with the IDB and governments within Mexico state governments. And we have followed the same approach. And one of the key aspects that I think have helped us to get there is that we've been able to put forward a modeling system through which we can show them the actual net benefits, monetary benefits that they can create by following these trajectories of net zero transition. So if you follow that, then I guess that the incentives are quite clear from the beginning for the political benefits and the economic benefits for the society. So I think that's key in our experience.
So you mean high quality methodology involvement of policymakers from the beginning, quantitative results that might come from interdisciplinary work together might be a real competitive advantage maybe for universities compared to other players that I tried to mention. So I just would like to invite all the others also maybe to provide or connect to this. Pablo, please.
Yeah, well, I would like to share with you the experience that we had in a EU project. Well, actually, 2 EU projects are called ORES-2-1 and ORES-2. These projects were about auctions, designing auctions for renewable energy. And, you know, they involve multidisciplinary research group, also different countries, of course, and different visions. And it was extremely interesting in the sense that what we did was an input into the, you know, the directive, the EU policy making on renewable energy. And the funny thing is that, or the good thing is that it involved an interactive discussion with policymakers, which, you know, it was like, you know, they influence the things that we would like also to, you know, touch upon later. You know, it was not only that we decided this, but, you know, it was an interactive, dynamic process. And I think that was really, really interesting and really encouraging for us as researchers. And so I think this is quite a good example of how research and, you know, policy making can interact, not only, you know, in one direction, but in a bilateral relation, you know, and I think it's like a way forward. I've been also involved in other projects, but, you know, these 2 ones are, I would say, you know, a clear example of, you know, of what would be, I wouldn't say best practice, but, you know, sort, you know, close to best practice on this interaction. Yeah.
Thank you really so much, because I think we are getting closer to really understanding what might be the competitive advantage of the research community and interdisciplinary research compared to other players to provide these solutions. Matt, please, you have a comment.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. And I think that researchers and students do want to make this change and be much more ambitious. And actually, we hear from students that's how they're choosing universities. So we need to really pay attention to that, I think, and make sure that that's part of the commitment of the institution. The hard part is that we need to make the research practice divide easier. The research students want to do this work, but it's actually very difficult at complex institutions to enable those bridges to happen. So a couple of quick examples at UBC that I think have been fairly successful. One is we also often use the campus as living lab frame and have, for example, research competitions where you must have a faculty researcher as well as a staff lead, and often students as well, to work on problems that are applied on campus settings and shared then broadly with the community. We have lots of examples of funding and student-led mechanisms to do that. And then the other piece is, you know, making the institutional commitment. UBC's made a commitment to reduce emissions 100% by 2035, but in parallel, it's this multi-solving with different agendas that's critical. So, you know, we're just recently the first university in the world to formally commit to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We've committed to implement the Okanagan Charter for Health Promoting Universities. And now we're struggling with how do you connect these agendas effectively? And I don't actually have the answer yet, but it's a kind of a convening question that we're all holding. And I'd love to hear if others have thoughts on that too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I think you again mentioned the living lab kind of concept and the very the real importance of involving also the students into the whole process, which is a great asset for I think for our community in this regard. Now, I just and that's really my last question on this issue. So, if you would just like to pinpoint out the most important competitive advantages of university-based interdisciplinary research to have an impact, concrete impact and action on policy making. So what else perhaps would you still mention beyond what we have already discussed? So what benefit we essentially kind of extra benefit we offer for the policymakers to work with us. How can we describe this? So because what I mean is that policy making mostly asks for fast solutions, very short-term results, within the electorate term. They need sometimes partisan solutions that they can sell to the party and the government. Internally, politically feasible solutions. University, on the other hand, is a little bit slower, is neutral, empirical, study-based, more. I mean, a little bit different products that can be produced compared to what policymakers might need. So I just was maybe a little bit pressing the issue. How can we define what are our advantages really when we want to produce solutions to policymakers?
Peter, I mean, I've got an example of that could be useful, because I think interdisciplinary work is both inside and outside the institution. And I think that's what I really like what Luis was saying about his work with policymakers in Latin America. We've got an example of how we worked on wildfires. The UN only has 2 staff working on wildfires, which is not ideal. And wildfires are a growing phenomenon. And we wanted to step back and think about what are the best recommendations we can make for governments about what they needed to do with the rising trends of wildfires, which are sadly exponential. And so we worked with 100 academics to come up with a new framework to try and move away from response to wildfires to planning, prevention, recovery, and to balance the budgets. We're now working with academics to try and do an accountability mechanism to assess budgets to see how they could be different. And then also when it comes to recovery, we're also working with a group of academics to work out what is the way that you can mitigate the risk of wildfire by planting differently, or also investing in locations where there's a high propensity of fire to try and mitigate that outcome as well. So it's using the scientific advantages of the researchers we worked with to make it hyper practical with policymakers to see what they could do differently, with specific recommended terrestrial investments in locations that would be pertinent about what they could do to make a difference. So I think we worked on this year, and we'd spent 2 years trying to get the research together. And that's a significant breakthrough for, I think, the UN to think differently about wildfires. So you stop thinking them about a natural phenomena that needs kind of firemen and fire engines and water dropped from the sky, but to think about more of a planning, prevention, recovery response. So I feel like universities are our greatest friend at the UN. They do remarkable work for us, and without many of them, we'd be lost. The emissions gap report that came out last week that showed the challenge we face, all of that was done by academia. And so I think that integrated approach with new insight, but new recommendations and accountability is the partnership that we want. And I think universities on interdisciplinary skills is something that's hard for me to recommend, because that's an internal phenomena that I have a lack of external perspectives on. But the interdisciplinary opportunity outside of the institution to work together on collective challenges is something that we're very keen to do a lot more on. So wildfires I use as just one example, but what we want to do is research plus action, plus accountability, plus specific recommendations. And that's what we want to see more of.
Excellent example again. Thank you very much, Sam. And my next question is really related to this and relates to the question, how do you think can science policy and science funding policy can really improve those characteristics of interdisciplinary university-based research that are most beneficial for policymakers involved in net zero transition related decision making? So if you have any message on how then the science policy can further strengthen all those very encouraging capabilities of us, that would be interesting to hear from you. Pablo, please.
I think it is important that support for of course for interdisciplinary research is provided. I think we have improved somehow in the last decades in this. For example, at EU level, we can see that this is clear that there has been much more funding for this. But I think that, you know, from a research point of view, at least, I think it's also an issue of recognition, you know, and how, I mean, career paths, you know, are mostly disciplinary nowadays still, you know, so we would need like a very fundamental change in how science is, you know, assessed, you know, for at least, and this is even more the case for early careers, you know, for the people who are studying now, you know, this. So for your question, science policy can do a lot, you know, it's doing, in my view, it's doing a lot in Europe on this front, and, you know, providing transdisciplinary research, but I would miss, you know, an even more, you know, transformational change, which goes into the very, you know, the core of the incentives provided to, you know, researchers to do this, you know, and especially the younger ones who, you know, it's just, you know, they will be judged by peers on their disciplinary areas, some, you know, mostly. So this is, I mean, not in all countries probably, but I guess in most of them. So, you know, this is my take on that.
I think it's really general and absolutely true that incentives really bring young researchers towards, let's say, a scientific publication in a narrow way. Now, any other maybe recommendation how to improve the incentives for our young colleagues to get more rewarded and involved in interdisciplinary research addressing net zero? We are talking about net zero and concrete action, maybe not all areas are such that we need so much interdisciplinarity to tackle problems, but net zero transition and climate change is definitely one of those areas. So if any suggestion or maybe good example beyond Europe, maybe in Mexico or
well, yeah, I think that it starts with the organizational architecture of the university. I mean, if you place the right frame towards those young researchers and you provide and you need to place seed funding at some point as well. I mean, it's not like at the beginning they're going to publish, spend time teaching, and then apart from that they're going to try to think outside the box of other disciplines and get together. So you have to be aware that at the beginning it's going to be hard for them to do that. So you place them with certain types of incentives that are already within the institution. And then from there, you try to create also mentorship programs with other researchers that are well advanced in their own research agenda with multidisciplinary networks. So I think that the organizational architecture is key to that. And we have been working towards changing that in Tec de Monterrey. We have placed also a call, an internal call for a challenge-based research where we place the actual challenge as opposed to other type of free research areas. And one of those is related precisely to net zero. So we said to them, okay, we want you to address these problems and we want you to address them in a multidisciplinary way. And we are also trying to provide a system of qualification for them to making an incremental benefit of producing multidisciplinary papers in multidisciplinary journals as opposed to discipline journals. And we know that they have a trade-off. There's an opportunity cost for them to go into that realm, but that's the only way in which we think we are going to make progress as fast as we need to.
Thank you very much, Luis. Alberto. Indeed, we might have some, we are very much running to the end of our time. We have time for our panel, 3 more minutes. So I just check out the questions we got. And maybe I would just like to read one from Tobias Bade. interdisciplinarity definition and potential can be difficult to promote even inside a faculty, university, or research council. Policymakers often find themselves in a sectorial ministry. Is your experience that it is difficult to pass on broad science advice to influential policymakers? What's your experience, please? Is it difficult to pass through the messages to influential policymakers? Well, if I may mention my own experience, well, it very much depends on the person who is in charge. So you have to have good science-based research as well as a good deal of luck to have your colleague on board. But I don't know if you have more wiser comment on that, please. Please.
I can just jump in a very quick comment. I think that it's on everybody's mind, but we haven't backed it up with the resources and funding to actually see that through and create mechanisms for that kind of work to happen. So I think a stronger call to universities to commit at the most senior levels to do this kind of work and to partner with all different sectors in society to do that work is needed, and to really think differently about breaking down the silos to enable this is critical.
Okay, thank you. And my last comment will reflect to the call of Sam on a more radical approach of universities on this issue. My question is, would you agree? And if yes, is there any message how to, and at what point, what is the Archimedean point to change our behavior at universities to get on track with that proposal? So maybe the question is, would you agree that that we need changed quite dramatically the attitude of the universities towards addressing climate change, or it's not so important? We can work on more with the conservative way that we have been doing that until now. Luis.
No, I mean, definitely not. I mean, if we, as I think we all know, we're late. We're running late already. So, but the key is, as probably we're all aware, and I think Matt reflected on that as well in terms of students selecting universities that are really committed towards net zero transitions. I think that it all starts with students' activism as well, outside university, and in terms of them being the carriers of the needs for society. If those guys, because at the very end, and at least I'm speaking right now in terms of the context in Mexico, those guys are seen as boats. And if you think of the constituencies of the policymakers and the political actors, then you think that if those guys are the ones who really want measures to be taken, then I think it's when things can change dramatically. Universities are already trying to work with firms, with governments, with local agencies, international organizations, and NGOs. We're already there. It's just a matter of certain the last mile, right? In terms of these political actors to actually embed within their own cost-benefit analysis what we really want as a society, and I think that the young generation is responsible for that, and I think they will be the game changer within the next years in our country. But I think that as a university, our role is to promote those young generations to do that.
Well, for me, this is really a perfect final comment on our panel, and a very optimistic one, and reaffirming that I mean, what we should do is really go that way and reach out to our politicians as well as our students and the young generation to find the correct solutions. My question is there any of the panelists would like to make a final word? Pablo, please.
No, well, I was just going to say something on the last point as well. I think that universities and research centers are not isolated from the science and technology, ecosystem. So what you need to do, I would even go further than that. I think that what you need is to put incentives at that level, and also from the top down, and from the bottom up. And, I think this is, so I would support this transformative thing that you mentioned, but also, at a even higher level than that. And we have seen some moves on this, ERC provides interdisciplinary funding for research. Horizon Europe does that as well, and what we need is to put that into many national science systems, as well, where universities are involved, so it's just an even broader issue than the universities, in my view. But
yeah, Peter, if I can just build on what Pablo said. It's very hard for organizations to change themselves internally. The best way that change happens is externally. The more you can empower students who pay for your salaries and pay their fees to come to your faculties to be empowered to tell you what kind of university they want to go to, the more likely change will happen. So I would empower students to have a meaningful voice, not just give you money. And if you do that, then change will happen faster than you can imagine. And I think how you work with students in a meaningful way and to work with them will mean that your teaching will be better, your offer will be stronger, and your purpose will be even deeper. And so how you work with students, I think, will be the change about how you reform, because institutions that are built with very impermeable kind of cultures find it very hard to change. So the more you unleash your students to challenge you, the more the change will happen.
Great, thank you. Matt, final word.
I completely agree with Sam. I was going to say the same thing. I think the two areas where I see the biggest potential for change makers and transforming our thinking is putting the youth and the students front and center and Indigenous people front and center. And we can then, put them in these panels, give them the voice, learn from them, and then the research architecture can hopefully support and come along.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution and this very interesting and inspiring discussion. I will try to pass the major messages to the next panel. And with this, I would like to conclude the panel. Thank you again.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for your excellent moderation. Please, colleagues, stay connected because we have one more session, but this very interesting session as well. The presidents of the organizing committee will speak and will reflect on our commitments. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or morning or evening, depending on the part of the world where you are in, because I understand we have participants from several geographical areas in the world. So we are ready to start with the session in which the presidents of the organizing committee of this symposium are going to present their intentions, their commitments. I think this is a very, very important session because it is an example of what we have been hearing in the previous sessions, that we need institutional leadership. So I am delighted to hand the moderation of this session to Tim Bedford from Strathclyde University.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So I just wanted to make a few opening remarks here. Last year, CESAER, ISCN, Science Europe, and the University of Strathclyde as the host came together in advance of COP26, which was hosted, of course, in Strathclyde's home city of Glasgow. We issued a joint position in our call to action addressed to the research community as a whole. And of course, this recognized that the research community is an essential component of the battle against climate change because of our capabilities, our connectedness, and our spread across the globe, which enables us to share ideas and practice across governments, enterprises, and local communities. But we also recognize that to really deliver, we would need to get our own house in order, changing the way we operate, both in the way that we do research, the way we do our teaching, and the way we operate as organizations. And we agreed then to come back in a year, which is why we're here today, with the theme of this conference really focused on interdisciplinarity, which was the first of the major elements of the call to action. And very importantly, we welcome UNICA and EUA today to the event, and we're looking to expand also with other networks. And I think that's a great opportunity there, and it'll be very exciting. So we will be coming back in a year. Now, for this final session, alongside the leaders, we're very pleased to have the moderators from the first two sessions. And I'm going to ask them to give us a summary of the discussion the excellent discussion that took place earlier on. So let me first go to Douglas Halliday.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction. It was a real pleasure to be invited to participate and indeed to moderate such a stimulating discussion. So I'm going to summarize the key points that emerged from that. I think at the outset, the group acknowledged the challenge of promoting interdisciplinary working, and I think that remains. We heard some interesting examples of how universities learned from the COVID pandemic, which demonstrated that universities can break down silos, adopt new ways of working, and also encourage greater cooperation across different departments and indeed across sectors, making bridges between industry and society. It was acknowledged that students more readily see benefits in interdisciplinary working. It can often give them a more positive educational experience, living labs, challenge-based learning. We also heard examples of different groups looking at things like air quality, stormwater as specific examples. Interdisciplinarity needs to be seen in an open sense. Boundaries should be flexible to meet specific challenges. We don't want the concept of interdisciplinarity to become a rigid framework in the way that some academic disciplines are. So I think that's important as interdisciplinarity develops in our own understanding. The panel also acknowledged there's a need to look at how research is funded, assessed, and recognised in terms of careers and progression. They stressed the recognition for the reform of research excellence to facilitate and promote interdisciplinary working. And I'm aware that people are involved in other networks that are specifically looking at that. Interdisciplinarity breaks down existing silos in universities, which are embedded in university structures. I think there's a need to see interdisciplinarity effectively embedded into university culture. And interdisciplinary workers need to recognise the role that every discipline has to play. It's about creating an effective community of equals. Research communities are created around defined research questions, around defined research problems, so we can expect interdisciplinary working will also create new communities. So how we promote and extend those communities is important. We've heard examples of areas of focus of interdisciplinary thematic communities around things like carbon emissions, sustainability working, and so on. I think interdisciplinarity helps to illuminate and reveal civic mission of universities with wider benefit to societies. This can link powerfully with individuals and citizens groups, empowering people to influence local and national policy. Interdisciplinarity also challenges the culture and values of universities as large organizations. Effective internal communication is often overlooked and is a really critical component which is needed to successfully embed interdisciplinarity into evolving university research culture. Interdisciplinarity is powerfully revealed in addressing societal challenges. To enable this, funding agencies do acknowledge that academics have opportunity to take greater risk, and it is noted that reviewing interdisciplinary research proposals requires careful selection of referees. We talked about how interdisciplinarity speaks to academic identity. We heard an example of where new academic faculty staff must be appointed across 2 schools. And I think we'll see more of that kind of approach as interdisciplinarity becomes further embedded. It was noted that it's often seen through the lens of sustainable development goals, and there are a range of views in the panel about the usefulness of this particular lens. In the context of an overall systems view, it can be difficult for members of society to connect with SDGs as a sort of systemic framework. It's easier to assimilate the need for interdisciplinary working when the challenges relate directly to specific challenges faced by individuals. For example, food, illness, living conditions, housing, and so on. And then finally, we noted that interdisciplinarity has a critical role in training future professionals. An important dimension of this is to continue with cross-sectoral mobility as an integral aspect of university programs. It's key really to forming future leaders able to tackle climate and environmental emergency. So I hope I've done justice in summarizing panel one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Yeah, it was a great discussion there. So let me come now to Peter Kalijet. I can't see you at the moment, Peter. But you're welcome from the second session. So Peter, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim and dear colleagues. I try to very briefly summarize the conclusions of the former session, which was, I think, very formative, reconfirming that interdisciplinary research really provides a competitive advantage over other players to provide well-funded solutions for policymakers locally and globally to net zero, to the challenges of net zero transition. I think very important examples have been provided by the panelists indicating that the methodology for policy, supporting policy making, the ability for complex understanding of the problems, the credibility of the research community to provide the right answers to the change, living lab solutions involving our greatest resource, the 250 million students every year who enroll into universities, and also designing complex technology and social systems for policymakers really make the university research community and interdisciplinary research as a very competitive partner for decision makers, high-level decision makers for net zero transition. Now, that's the good news, but in order to better extract these opportunities from the universities, maybe the most frequently mentioned concept during the panel was change. So we need to change to radically change the thinking about approaching the problem, about innovation, as well as changing the operation of our institutions. And often this change can be best promoted by external impacts, including incentives for science policy making, and also expectations from the younger generation. It was also concluded that it is very important to change the incentives for the younger generation of researchers to get them even better involved in interdisciplinary research, so that these incentives compensate them for the opportunity cost of not spending time on disciplinary research and publication in a conventional manner. So it's very important to think about a potential further improvement in those incentives that at least we heard in Europe are already there and has been started to have an impact. Finally, a related issue that a conclusion was that when designing the research funding schemes, maybe even more attention to the above aspects should be taken into account. So changing incentives it turned out to be a critical need and requirement from the panel. At least this is my incomplete assessment of the conclusions of the rich panel we had.
Thank you, Peter. And again, that was a really rich discussion that we had earlier on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to each of the panel members to ask them for their initial response to the discussions that have been held. And we're very delighted that the presidents of each of the associations that are participating here have been able to come and join us. And so Angelika Kalt, I would like to come to you first from Science Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Just to say, I'm not the president of Science Europe. I'm just replacing Mark Shields. I'm one of the. I'm currently vice president of Science Europe, but I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So, if you're asking me for my comment on the first two panels and what I gather from it is that there are. Evidently, everybody recognizes the importance of interdisciplinary working in order to really achieve the net zero or the green transition. And there are lots of initiatives. And I think I would stress the importance that these things are quite often small-scale projects, initiatives of individuals or groups. And as was said in the previous panels, people have to identify with something. So it shouldn't be abstract, like framework SDGs, but it should be very concrete. So I think this is something that we as umbrella organizations have to keep in mind for our own activities. And so I think, as has been said the last time, the marge de manœuvre is very large. So universities, research funders, research performers can act by, for example, putting money on the table and incentives, resources, time for doing research on interdisciplinary research towards the green transition. That's one thing they can do. The other thing is they can make sure that the activities that they do themselves and that research does itself is also something that goes towards sustainable behavior. We talked about that the last time about methods to measure, for example, carbon footprint. And then, of course, every one of these organizations can do lobbying with their national or local governments and decision takers. So what can an umbrella organize? So what comes out of the panel for me is, how do we make the link between what is happening really there and what the umbrella organizations can do? And I think what we can do, and now I'm talking specifically about Science Europe as the organization of research performers and funders, is that our first task is to make visible what our members are doing. And that is, for example, visible in the report that Science Europe has been publishing today, and which Malin has also been talking about in the first panel. So how do the members encourage interdisciplinary research, for example? And there you can see there's a multitude of things. There's lots of openness, and I think it's very good to be able to benefit from the best practices of other members, for example. So that's one of the tasks of the umbrella organization, to share and advertise best practices. And then, of course, it's also a question to what extent you can align strategies. So, for example, also there, Science Europe has quite, let's say, a strong point for research working more in the direction of giving a contribution to societal challenges. So it's about aligning the strategies, of having an overall strategy. That's also one thing that we can do. And then, of course, we can do what we're doing today. We can try to line up even with a larger umbrella, with different umbrella organizations. But I wouldn't overestimate the role of the umbrella organizations, but because I think the major power is in the, let's say, in the regional local forces and in the ideas of the people that they have. So that's maybe a first input into what I've heard in the panels.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to go to Michael Murphy, the president of European Universities Association. And Michael, we're really delighted that EUA was happy to join us in this endeavor.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for the invitation. You've asked for an initial response, and I guess my initial response is that there were no surprises in the panel discussions. We have significant challenges across the spectrum. Positive point, universities themselves have become exemplars of best practices in pursuing net zero. We conducted a survey last year. We had responses from about 370 universities, and it's online, but what was impressive was the extent to which universities have engaged with the agenda in achieving net zero in our own institutions. The big challenge, of course, is the subject of today, and that is promoting interdisciplinarity so that we deliver the research and graduates with the skill sets to enable net zero achievement in society. So that's our big challenge internally. Externally, we have to address policymakers, to make sure that policy is fit for purpose from a societal perspective, but secondly, to ensure that policymakers create the conditions for within which universities can be successful in discharging our role. And I must say on that one, we are starting from, well, we're behind the curve. If you just look at the Commission's Green Deal communication 2 years ago, there was hardly any reference to universities as enablers of the Green Deal. And so as umbrella organizations charged with advocacy and lobbying, we have a real task in that regard. And I think we've got to focus somewhat in our discussion on how we as a collective of umbrella organizations can grow the impact of our sector on policymakers, and not least to create the conditions for universities successfully addressing research and skill set development for the population. So no surprises so far in the content.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me now turn to Luciano Sasso, the president of UNICA.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here. So let me start saying that interdisciplinarity is a characteristic that really UNICA has since the beginning. I've been working in the last 17 years in UNICA, and I remember since the beginning that, in all meetings related to research, to education, to other activities of UNICA, that was there as a main, element. So that is something that we have, I would say, in our DNA. And now, I mean, with these challenges, towards the zero transition, the net zero transition, of course, interdisciplinarity is key. And let me say that UNICA has, in my view, a couple of strong points there. One of them is that, is an organization with universities based in capital cities. So in a way is close to the government of our country. So we can actually try to voice directly, the results of our discussion to our politicians somehow. So to try to move forward, in the direction of the results of our debates. And another important point is our strong, I would say, activities with students. UNICA organizes every 2 or 3 years, depending on how the pandemic made a bit some changes in our schedule. But every 2 or 3 years, we have a large student conference with students coming from all UNICA countries gathering together. Before COVID, it was always in person. Now we are using hybrid or online models, of course. And that is another strength. For instance, in 2010, in the UNICA Student Conference in Rome, students really asked, us as leaders of UNICA, why don't we, have a stronger, work on sustainable development? And actually, after that, request by students, we created a group, the UNICA Green and SDGs group, and the coordinator Matthew Lawson was in the first panel today. So that was really a result, let's say, bottom up from our students asking that. I would say we're very committed. Sustainable development was included in our last General Assembly in Dublin as one of the core values of UNICA. So it was included in the new, mission and vision of UNICA that was recently updated. We are continuing, to work again with members. As it was said in the beginning by Angelica, is the same. For us, I think visibility, sharing good practices is key. We have to try to make, visible what, is happening in our university among the members first, and then, of course, to the policymakers. And, of course, the challenges are different for different universities. UNICA, again, has universities in 41 capital cities in the countries of the Council of Europe. So we go from Iceland to Tbilisi, from Lisbon to Tallinn. So it's a very large territory. And of course, in different countries, the challenges are different, but we are very committed.
Thank you very much, Luciano. So now let me come to Jesus van der Goot, the president of the International Sustainable Campus Network. Over to you.
So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Douglas and Peter for two really interesting panels before. And one topic that came up is what's unique about universities in this big challenge we're facing. And so I just like to pick up some things that were mentioned in these panels, which I think are really important in how we can work together in this, which is the topic of this panel. As higher education institutions, but through our research, we're participating in creating knowledge and through our teaching and disseminating knowledge. So we have access to a huge pool of young people. We have, with respect to society, as opposed to politicians, we have an image of neutrality, which I think is absolutely key. Through the practices that we have in research, we are very connected across each other. But in addition, from being local, as Angelica mentioned, we have this connectedness to the community that surrounds us. And as opposed to politicians, which have their political schedule or agenda, we're considered as fact-based people. And we are considered as a community that has a certain rigor. And if we add to that the fact that a lot of the research in many countries is paid by public funds, we have a contract with society, and therefore we have their trust. And I think this is really a key element, is that as opposed to some other players in the arena, we have this trust and this social contract with them. So what do I see as ISCN as a role? So ISCN brings together now 100 different universities across the world. There's a new Latin American chapter, for example, recently, that are very active, and we've heard part of it in the previous session. But we heard about aligning. One way of aligning is sharing. There's a lot that works and a lot that doesn't work, and to be very concrete, as Angelica mentioned, I think is absolutely essential, because otherwise we're all reinventing the wheel, which is not very efficient. And so we can share many of the things that have just been mentioned before, and it goes from very concretely, how do you reduce the carbon footprint of your own institution, all the way to how do you change incentives and how science is evaluated. Because the problem of science evaluation is that it's global. We get letters for professors that we promote from all over the world. So we can't say, okay, I'm going to change this in my institution. We can only change it altogether. And I think that there, again, networks play an absolutely essential role. And just two last points I'd like to come back to, which came a lot in the last session, and which I completely agree with, is the importance of students and students in different ways, in their activist role, where they really they're a huge force of pushing and bringing reality into academia, which is really slow. I think I had never realized, being a researcher, you have the feeling it's fast, but when you start changing things, you realize how really slow we are. And so we're late, as was said, and we need to shift our ambitions and be really bold, because I think we have to honor the trust that the society has put in the academic world.
Thank you very much. Exciting and bold statements there. Very good. Let me come then finally to Rick van der Walle, the president of CESAER. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much, Douglas and Peter, as well, for your excellent summaries of sessions 1 and 2. Being the last one in a row, it's a little bit difficult to be innovative, but nevertheless, I will try to add some thoughts. First of all, Douglas was talking about lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, we did learn a lot of lessons, and of course, we did learn that interdisciplinarity is crucial in order to be able to tackle huge challenges as the COVID pandemic was. I would like to add this remark to that. We should not only look at interdisciplinarity within the broad field of science and technology, or even science and technology, including medical sciences. We should also look at, and I think we have to do a better job than we did so far in that respect. We should also look at the broad field of social sciences and humanities. If we look at the most important societal challenges we have ahead of us, like sustainability, then of course science and technology will play a crucial role in order to be able to tackle these challenges. But we will need knowledge, expertise, experts coming from the broad field of social sciences and humanities as well. And therefore, I think it's very good that an organization like CESAER and other organizations, of course, are focusing more than we did in the past on the importance of social science and humanities apart from science and technology. That's one comment I would like to add. Douglas and also Peter were touching on the issue of research funding, of course. There, I just would like to recall a statement that both CESAER and UNICA published almost 2 years ago, in which we were asking for providing, and I think this is really important, providing more long-term and sustainable funding for inter and transdisciplinary research, including not only funding to set up collaboration across institutions, but also within our institutions. We have to do more interdisciplinarity ourselves. We should do what we plea for. Institutions, for example, like my university, which is a comprehensive university, we have faculties and we have departments and we have schools. Quite often there are pretty strong barriers between these entities, and we should break them down. So we have to do a better job there. We should also try to create funding instruments to enable early stage researchers. People have been talking so far about young researchers, even students. I really believe that we should create funding instruments enabling early stage researchers to build capacity to develop larger collaborative and also high risk research projects related to the grand challenges such as the net zero transition. We should also move from the idea that we need single principal investigators. We should move from that idea to the idea to have what you could call co-principal investigators or teams of being led not only by one principal investigator, but by more than one. And maybe one final remark to start with respect to students, young people, learners. I think universities and knowledge institutes as a whole, we must, or at least must continue to educate and train our students and our learners to be aware, to really be aware of the challenges and their responsibility, and to act and also live sustainably through problem and challenge-based learning and teaching. By the way, I believe we also have to teach our teachers how to do that. Of course, we can ask our professors to try to learn our students how to tackle all these challenges. But the question is, do our teachers know how to do that? And maybe we have to teach our teachers, we have to teach our professors as well, in order for them to being able to do that. So these are some first comments from my side, but I'm sure we will have a discussion now.
Thank you very much, Rick. And yes, and we'd like to open that discussion up now. So many thanks to you all for your initial comments. I guess one of the, so we're getting a few questions from the audience, and so I will be, just to say to members of the audience, we will be looking at those, and I'll try and bring those into the conversation as much as I can. So do please bring those forward. I think I wanted to start off related to a point that Michael had made around policy, because I think, Michael, you said that actually we're behind the curve in terms of influencing policy. And maybe we could drill into that a little bit more in the context of interdisciplinarity. I guess that one of the ways that universities or academic institutions, researchers have influenced is very much actually possibly through the disciplines. We have chief scientists, for example, we have scientific advisors in different areas. And I guess there's a question about whether we are sufficiently, as a research community, sufficiently interdisciplinary in the way we are influencing those policymakers. And so this is the question from Tobias Bardstrom. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so apologies or not. Saying that interdisciplinarity can be difficult. Sorry, let me go to the correct question he was talking about. It's about the question about how you policymakers finding themselves in a sectorial ministry. And is it your experience that it's difficult to pass on this broader interdisciplinary science to those policymakers in those sectoral ministries? So I don't know if you welcome any of you to come into this discussion and kick us off in this general direction.
I can answer.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So I've experienced this, for example, in Switzerland, where if you talk to the federal, because we're a federal country, federal office in charge of energy and the federal office in charge of environment, they won't necessarily have the same view of things. Whereas you think you're talking to the government, but within the government, they don't all agree, obviously, because they have a different business. And this makes things difficult for sure. I'm sure that was your question, but that's what I understood.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh, yes, Michael.
Yes, I think that's the case in every country. But of course, every country has the opportunity to change its ministry makeup every time there's an election. And you do see some countries reforming the distribution of their civil service to meet particular challenges in the country at that point in time. So there is the freedom to mix and match skills across the civil service. But if you're going to lobby for that, you will only succeed if you are credible in demonstrating that you have done it yourself back on your campus. And so before we go in to demand reform of the structures of ministries, and the Commission likewise, my God, we know that AAC doesn't talk to DGRI in our domain. At least we've got to go in showing what we have done and how it has worked. One point that hasn't been made, and that is that to move things forward in the university sector, it is good to have the state aligned with your objectives. And in many countries now, we have performance contracts that are signed annually between the state and universities. And we should maneuver in those countries that have them, and in those many countries that are thinking of embracing them, to ensure that the performance contracts are specifically designed to incentivize interdisciplinarity, to monitor its implementation, and to reward its implementation in the budget allocations that the state makes to public universities. So just there are 2 points. Reshaping can be done, and secondly, we can ally with the state to effect change within our own institutions.
Thank you. And Angelica, I think you had your hand up. Do you want to come in there?
Yes, just a very short example, because Giza was already talking about Switzerland. I guess we also face that problem. But what I think is, if there are already interdisciplinary research programs that are supposed to, solve a certain problem, which is the case in Switzerland, and then there are recommendations, scientific recommendations coming out of that you very, officially transmit to your government. But what's missing then is the follow-up. So you stop at that stage because you say that's where research is responsible and not any further. And then there's kind of a missing link between, the follow-up is missing. What's going to happen to these recommendations and how are they going to be picked up? And we're currently thinking about how we can do this by creating what we call implementation networks. Now I'm talking as not as Science Europe necessarily, but as one of the members of Science Europe, implementation networks where we keep, people that should use or will use these scientific results and our decision makers in contact with researchers in order to get the things further. But it's at the limit what you can still finance as a funder, because it's not really entirely research work, but it's very important.
Yeah, thank you. Rick?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of comments to what Michael said. Actually, what he said referred to what I was talking about earlier. Of course, it's a very good idea to try to come up with plans to have an interdisciplinary policy-making landscape, so to speak. But we have to be credible, as Michael said, and I really support that idea. We have to do this ourselves as well. And you might ask the question whether the university landscape itself is already interdisciplinarity oriented. Of course, we are setting up a lot of projects that are interdisciplinary projects and so on and so forth. But if you look at the structures of most of the universities, then it is still a rather rigid structure. We are structured, we have faculties, we have departments, we have schools, we have educational programs, and there are barriers between all these things and all these entities. So, and I don't have the answer, by the way, but the question is, how can we reshape ourselves, not only as university landscape, but also as individual universities, in order to be better prepared to tackle these challenges. For example, at my university, when you apply for a project, at least you have to say whether your faculty or your field of expertise belongs to science and technology, social science and humanities, or medical sciences, roughly speaking. If you are at the border of these domains, then quite often it is difficult to convince evaluation panels that it's important to do research on these border lines, so to speak. So I think we are all struggling with that question, and so far I did not see many universities coming to the front with radical changes. For example, Peter said, "Look, we need a radical change." That's true, I believe. But the question is, do we need a radical change in terms of structuring ourselves as universities as well? And if so, how do we do that? So I'm not giving an answer here, but I think it's an important question.
Thanks very much, and I think we'll get a lot of response from that. But let me go to Angelica. You've put your hand up.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up on what has just been said. It's not only the structures at the universities, but it's the entire reward system. We've been talking about that already the last time. So I think, and that's also, we're not credible if we have a reward system and if we have structures that are not prone to fostering this interdisciplinary research that we're all talking about. And so I think we have to do our homework. And so when you see what's happening, for example, the agreement on reforming the research assessment that has been elaborated under the responsibility of the European Commission, but where, for example, the European University Association and Science Europe have played a key role, or also the DORA declaration that many of the Science Europe members have signed now. This is being implemented, but it takes just a very long time because it's a cultural change. So the difficult question is, how can we speed this up? And this was said in panel 2 by Sam, I think, who said it's an existential pursuit and we need just to be much more rapid than we are currently. So things are going in the right direction by the incentives we give, by the contracts we make and so on. But how can we manage to speed this up? Because this is what is necessary. Everybody knows where it should go, but habits and all kinds of other things prevent us from getting there quickly enough.
No, thank you, Angelica. And I think that one of the interesting things is about this notion of speed. And to come back to a point that was made earlier about I think you talked about funding that was at the boundary of research. And is it not clear from the discussion that we've had, from the discussion in the panels, that actually universities and research institutions are trying to get out there to make a difference? And does that really require also a different kind of reward system, a different sort of funding system, which extends maybe the traditional notions of research? Because an awful lot of the research is going to be going on in communities. And a lot of that is also quite difficult to replicate because of cultural differences or other sorts of differences between society. And yet it will all need supporting if we're going to, as institutions, support a global transformation. Seems to me that often we talk, when we think about science is easily replicable from one part of the world to the other. But when we're talking about the social sciences, because cultures change so much across different parts of the globe, it's actually much more difficult to be able to replicate that and translate from one part of the world to another one. I'm just wondering if that really requires us to take a different perspective or a different approach.
Well, if I might, Tim, pick you up on that one, it's an astonishing fact that the universities sector has really lacked a global platform for conversations and to shape collective lobbying at a global level up to this point. And I have to say that 2 years ago at EUA, we spearheaded an attempt to address that. We have, in fact, established a global forum for the major university associations. We've got 9 of them around the table, all continents now sitting there, at least as a space just to exchange information, but hopefully ultimately a space where we can arrange collective advocacy opportunities. And I would hope that that would be one vehicle to address the point you've raised, the challenge posed by the cultural diversity and changing culture globally. Hopefully a small contribution.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the key themes that has come out of the discussion is around the students and the student body, and I thought it was quite interesting. The calls also to be led by them, by their activism, by their energy. I wonder if colleagues have got a comment on how we can usefully merge that with our institutions to help drive what our institutions are doing both locally and globally. Would anybody like to come in around that?
I might give a fast one. I'm sitting in the south of Ireland in a place called Cork. And in 2010, we became the first university in the world to get the green flag from the Foundation for Environmental Education for greening. And it's taken off a little. I think there are about 70 universities that now take part in this program. It worked because of one factor. We put the students in charge. The students were the originators of the idea. They had come from primary schools and secondary schools around the country, which flew green flags. I think most European countries have this program. But going a step further, recognizing that they had initiated it and that the energy resided among the student body, when we created management teams to follow through on energy management, recycling, etc., we got the students to chair those committees, not the university, not the university staff. And to be honest, it created a community energy that would not have existed otherwise. So I regard the students as not just the source of energy, but the people who will imbue management teams with the energy to do what needs to be done.
That was a really interesting example. Thank you. Let me come to Rick. You put your hand up.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Michael just said. If I look at what happens in my university, students are really in the driving seat, actually, of almost everything that we do in terms of policy making related to sustainability. On top of that, if you look at our educational programs, I really think it is important to try to get the students and also the teachers out of their comfort zone. Going out of your comfort zone is always difficult. So you need to convince people to do that. And actually, one of the methodologies, if you want, that we are using for that is, or to say, creating safe spaces, so to speak, in order to be able to do that. Is the following. We are part of a European University Alliance, and within the European University Alliance, which is in our case Enlight, we are setting up prototypes, trials, in order to find out what is working and what is not working in terms of having teachers and students going out of their comfort zone. I really think that we have to recognize that we as universities and university leaders, we don't know the answers to all the questions. So we have to find out how we can reshape universities and university policy making in order for us to be able to tackle these challenges. So we need to create safe spaces, so to speak. And maybe these European University Alliances are a safe place to do that.
Thank you, Rick. Luciano.
Yes, no, I fully agree about what was said. Indeed, we really need to give responsibility and possibility to the students to drive, drive us in the right direction. As I said, in UNICA, we have this tradition of the student conferences. And also what was mentioned by Rick related to the alliances. I think this is also a very important element because, as you know, there are at the moment 44 alliances in Europe already funded with a size between 8 and 12 universities each. So a size that is smaller compared to the size of our networks. But this can give you the advantage of being very concrete in all certain actions like interdisciplinary courses, European degrees. We are facing in the alliances some difficulties really to concretely have some action that apparently they were easy to make, like a European degree, but then you face a lot of issues related to accreditation and other things like this. So I think that is another element very important. And organizations like ours can play the role of umbrella organization, try to share again good practices and guide, all together the alliances in the right direction with the students playing a major role. And in UNICA, about 80% of the UNICA members are in one alliance. So I think this is something that is very, very much feasible.
Thank you. Angelica.
Okay, as Science Europe, research performers and research funders, we're not so much into contact with students ourselves, but I would just like to add that putting seed money schemes that are easily accessible on the table also with very young researchers, not necessarily students, but very young researchers is something that can nicely complement what has been said before.
Thanks so much. Oh, and
yeah, I just want to mention an initiative within the ISCN where we actually want to propose and have started projects within whatever sustainability office around the school, the universities that are part of it, where students even from other universities could work on that topic and address the challenge. So creating at the same time the network and getting the expertise in the school where there are students that have it and are willing to give it to the cause.
Thank you. We're beginning to come towards the end of today's meeting. And so I want to reflect a little bit on where we've been and where we're going. And I think one of the key points that has been made by a number of you is we're a network of networks, if you like. We've all got members, and so we need to be thinking a little bit about what we do from the network perspective and how we can influence both our members, how we can influence policy, how we can really create a kind of positive direction, amplify, if you like, the kinds of initiatives that we're taking or that we see amongst our members in order to speed up this process of tackling climate change. So when we came together last year, as I said, we agreed this call to action with its 6 different elements. We agreed that we would come back together this year in order to note what has been done so far. We wanted to expand the group, and we're delighted that there are that UNICA and EUA have joined today, and will be and others we hope will also be joining us soon. The question is, we've addressed a little bit about the positive progress that has been made, but of course the situation globally is very, very challenging. There's war in Europe. There's a speed up of climate change. So that requirement to go fast has changed to be making it even faster. So the question is, what can we be doing as networks? What can we be doing to accelerate this process? And where should we be looking? Where should we be looking to be able to accelerate the actions that our communities can make in a positive way towards addressing climate change? Where should we be doing, and what should we be doing next? It's an open question to you all. I'm hoping, of course, that some of you will have the answer. Yeah, Angelica.
Well, just a suggestion. If I look at the average age of people that are discussing here, I would say it would maybe be a good move to include younger people in the discussions that we have and have their views.
That's a very well made point. Yes, thank you. Rick.
Maybe very briefly, Tim, first of all, I think it is important to say that our call to action, that we are still supporting that call to action, and we should really emphasize that. I also think that we as network leaders, we should convey the message to each of our individual members in the future as well as we did in the past, and maybe even more. We should inspire our members, but not only our members, I believe, also maybe other organizations to come on board with respect to our call to action. One other reflection, so to speak, is the following. We are now focusing on Europe. The question might be whether we should or should not focus a little bit more beyond Europe as well. Maybe we should liaise with global networks, global organizations, non-European organizations. For example, Ghent University recently joined what is called the University Global Coalition, which is a collaborative platform to globally engaged universities and higher education associations working in partnership with the UN and other stakeholders to create a more sustainable future. So maybe this is something we could explore as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Jesus, yes, I'll come to you first then, because of course you were telling us about your Latin American chapter. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think what ISCN could offer to Science Europe or CESAER or UNICA is the connection to the other countries in the world. And Victoria Smith, who's the executive director of ISCN, is very actively working with different universities in the world. And the Latin American one is a great example of where helping them make a group, this has rapidly much more impact. And we've heard in the previous session members of this Latin American chapter. So I think this is key. Again, we could use, I agree with Angelica, next time we have this meeting, we should have some students from different, by extension, Rebellion, whatever. I think that would be important, but also to have internships. And this is something that we're trying to set up at ISCN, either virtual or physical, where people actually go to somewhere else in the world. And because I mean, in Western countries, we've been spoiled for many years. And so we're not so good at finding pragmatic solutions to certain things. That in countries that have been less spoiled, they come up with all kinds. I mean, we see it in India, Pakistan, etc. So I think interacting with countries that have learned to live with a lot of things. For example, now we see it with the climate crisis. Our students, when you tell them there's going to be a power blackout for a few hours, it's like, no, this is not going to happen. I grew up in traveling around the world. There was every day there were a few hours where there was no electricity. So I think we can learn a lot from interacting with other countries.
Thank you. And actually, maybe I should say that we've been also talking to the Association of Commonwealth Universities, which has got many universities across the globe now. They'll be here next year. They've expressed a strong interest in this. Michael.
I think picking up a point that Jisoo made a moment ago and elaborating further, I'm struck in these conversations and meetings with the extent to which we end up with a compendium of challenges, almost insurmountable challenges, an agenda that is as long as a piece of string. And sometimes it's useful in these circumstances to stand back and ask the question, where can we find examples of deviant success in addressing some of these matters? It might be a very useful exercise and an uplifting one at the end of the day to create a short compendium of successes in addressing some of these matters. For example, there are undoubtedly universities that have addressed interdisciplinarity pretty successfully. I'm what's called a clinical pharmacologist by training. It is a discipline that developed in the past 50 years in a certain number of institutions, largely in the US. Perhaps if I'm still alive, it's an example of deviant success, at least as a clinical pharmacologist. Likewise, advocacy success. There are undoubtedly institutions and countries where this has been done successfully. Best practice in student engagement. We talked about a few examples there earlier. Best successes in growing the scientific literacy of policymakers so that we can actually communicate with them. So perhaps rather than going around the houses year after year with a list of challenges, it might be useful just to make a short compendium of examples of deviant success, which can then be promulgated for replication. Just a thought.
It's a great thought, Michael. Thank you very much for that. Actually, so when we did this last year, we did actually have a whole set of videos about different topics, which were trying to do exactly that. And I think we've dropped it this year, but I think that's a great example. And as you say, it can be very inspiring, I think, as well as demonstrating the practical, the practical ways in which our institutions really do make a difference. So colleagues, I think we've come to the end of this session. So I want to thank all of our panelists here today very, very much for their contributions and for the really interesting debate. And I'll finally hand over to Lydia for the final words.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for the excellent moderation of this session and stimulating this very fruitful discussion. Thank you all the presidents, Michael Murphy, Vice President Angelica Kalt, Rick van de Valle, Luciano Sasso, and Gizu van der Groot. Also to Douglas Holiday and Peter Varashek for their excellent moderation and insights. There are so many things that have been said that is impossible to give a summary in 1 minute. So I just would like to say, building on the discussion we just had with the presidents, that we are faithful to the vision that is spelled out in the vision. Academic organizations working together, and I remind ourselves that we're put in our vision in interaction with industry and society. So maybe that is our next step, is to go beyond the academic sector and not only invite the students as we are discussing here, but also foster this interaction between with industry and society at large. I would like to thank very much my colleagues, Laura Colò at UNICA, Sergio Mattei Lucacci at EUA, Luis Dragol at CESAER, Victoria Smith at ISCN, Nicola Dotti at Science Europe, Tim Bedford, of course, very much thank you for your support, and Tom Foote also at the University of Strathclyde, and our respective communications departments, which have worked in a very collaborative way. This in itself is a value, that the teams of these organizations are working so well together. I think this is very worth pursuing. We remain committed to sharing and give visibility to your institutional experiences, to facilitate the alignment of strategies whenever possible, and to advocate for our capacities, as I think it was very well said during Peter's session, the competitive advantage that our organizations have when it comes to policy development or contributions to policy development, and also to advocate for the needs that our organizations need to perform those missions at its best. So I would like to say thank you very much to all, also to the participants. And we look forward to the next time where we will meet together and hopefully with even more networks and participants. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.